norepinephrine, cortisol, and growth hormone. All of these are going to stimulate the breakdown of fat through lipase. Lipase is an enzyme that's going to help initiate the separation of the free fatty acids from the glycerol backbone. Figure 4.2 will talk about a new discovery and its effect on fat metabolism and weight loss. Figure 38, hormone regulation of fluid and electrolytes during exercise. When you exercise, especially in hot environments, and you sweat, the plasma volume is going to decrease. That's going to increase the osmolarity of all of the molecules or substrates or anything that's in the blood. It's also going to increase hydrostatic pressure. It's going to mean that the heart has to more forcefully contract to get the more viscous plasma out of it. It's going to increase the strain on the heart. It's also going to decrease blood pressure. There are hormones that correct these fluid imbalances. Some of them come from the posterior pituitary gland, the adrenal cortex, and the kidneys. From the posterior pituitary gland, there's a secretion of ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and also oxytocin. It's produced in the hypothalamus and travels to the posterior pituitary. And remember, the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland serve as a bit of a feedback mechanism to each other. The hypothalamus is going to send neural signals to the pituitary, and then the pituitary is going to send hormonal signals through the body. So it's through the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland that the central nervous system and the endocrine gland system or the endocrine system have a little bit of a crossover or some type of constraint to each other. What would be the emergent properties of the central nervous system being constrained to the endocrine system? An interesting discussion. With a release in the antidiuretic hormone, there's an increase in water absorption at the kidneys. That's going to make it so that the blood plasma volume increases, and then there's going to be a reduction in the overall concentration of any of the molecules, which is going to return the osmolarity within inside the cell to a particularly normal level. If there's less water in the urine, it acts as a feedback mechanism for the release of the antidiuretic hormone. So again, another negative feedback mechanism that's going to allow for the regulation of hormones. The stimulation for the ADH releases a reduction in plasma volume, potentially caused by an increase in sweating during exercise. It's also going to be triggered by an increase in osmolarity. If there's too many molecules mixed into the blood plasma volume, it's going to increase the osmolarity. It's going to increase the relative concentration of any of those particular molecules within the blood. In order to regulate that, what's going to happen is a reduction of ADH and an increase in the uptake of water in those cells to return the relative concentration of those molecules within the plasma and the blood volume to normal levels. Figure 4.6 will give you an explanation of this process, and the animation 4.6 will tell you more about that. So I'm assuming that you guys can take a look at those things, but we just pretty much discussed it. Figure 43 talks about the release of hormones from the adrenal cortex that may help regulate fluid and electrolytes. The adrenal cortex is going to secrete mineral corticoids. One of the major ones is aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to increase sodium retention by the kidneys, increase sodium retention, which is going to increase water retention via osmosis, which is going to also help increase the excretion of potassium. So it's going to help with electrical signal transduction and also returning of hyper or hypoosmotic situations. It's going to help return the osmolarity of the cells to a more normal situation. Aldosterone is going to be released when there's a reduction in blood plasma sodium, when there's a reduction in blood plasma volume and blood pressure, and also an increase in plasma potassium. So it's going to just act as a regulatory mechanism so that electrical signals and osmolarity can be maintained. The kidneys also release various hormones, erythropoietin and renin. Those are hormones that eventually are going to trigger antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. Again, a closed feedback loop. Erythropoietin is also going to be released by the kidneys, which is going to be triggered by the low blood oxygen in the kidneys. That's gonna, because there's a low blood oxygen being detected in the kidneys. It's gonna the EPO is going to result in a stimulation of red blood cells, and that red blood cells will potentially be able to attach to more oxygen in the bloodstream and make it so that the concentration of oxygen in the blood can be maintained. But again, that's going to be a negative feedback loop. When there's low blood oxygen in the kidneys, there's a reduction in some other hormone, which is going to help regulate the body. So another system that we see between oxygen and erythropoietin, and what emerges is the ability to maintain oxygen levels. This is critical for individuals who are training at altitude or in low oxygen environments. So another system that allows for emergence to occur. Also, there's renin, which is released from the kidneys. Renin is an enzyme, is released when there's a low blood volume and low blood pressure. There's also released when sympathetic nervous system is activated. The sympathetic nervous system is going to potentially, or not potentially, is going to affect blood pressure, heart rate, and the ability to get fuel and oxygen to the muscles. So when there is a reduction in blood volume and reduction in blood pressure, that's going to become a stimulus for the sympathetic nervous system to increase blood pressure and increase its output. So there's yet another system and another feedback mechanism for renin and the sympathetic nervous system. Maybe that's why they call it a sympathetic nervous system. And here on slide 46, you see is a renin, angiotensin, aldosterone mechanism. Those hyphens between renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone, they are constraints that imply a system. Right, so you can see that renin is going to be intricately involved with the conversion of angiotensinogen to angiotensin, and all sorts of other different connections between one hormone and one electrolyte, or one hormone and one system of the body. And it seems as though it's the hormones that are making the decisions, but it's actually the hormones interacting with other tissues and other receptors and DNA that allows for the emergence of changes to occur, not necessarily the endocrine system initiating demands and commands and such. Figure 4.7 talks a little bit more about the kidneys functioning, but we just discussed that, and there's an animation on slide 48 to talk a little bit more about that. I'm just assuming that you guys can take care of that. Figure 4.8 shows that through the bout of exercise, the blood plasma volume is going to reduce, and in order to try to regulate that, the aldosterone is going to increase in terms of its plasma volume. So aldosterone is very important in terms of working with the sympathetic nervous system, to increase blood plasma volume and make sure that the heart rate doesn't have to go too high and the blood pressure doesn't drop too much in order to pump out the appropriate amount of oxygen to the muscles. Figure 5.0 is also supported by animation 4.9. Sorry, that's slide 50, which is figure 4.9, is complemented by animation 4.9. I'm assuming that you guys can go through that. Osmolarity is when the concentration of dissolved particles in the blood plasma increases or decreases. If there's an increase in the dissolved particles, there's hyperosmolality, and if there's a reduction in dissolved particles, there is a reduction in osmolality. If there's an increase in osmolality, typically water is going to be, osmolality increases, water is drawn out. Measure of concentration of dissolved particles. Yes. Oh, interesting. Osmolality, when there is an increase in the concentration in body fluid compartments, there's an increase in osmolality. And when there is a reduction in those components and dissolved particles, there is a reduction in osmolality. Now, I'll have to take a look at this again, but I thought that when there is an increase in osmolality, it's going to trigger water being drawn in to help regulate the actual and return the concentrations of each of those dissolved particles back to a normal value. If the inside of the cell has not enough dissolved particles, then I was under the assumption that water would be drawn out in order to help regulate that particular concentration back to a 300 osmolarity normal value. But maybe I was wrong. Oh, okay. And then what happens is, sorry, on figure 53, because there's an increase in osmolarity and water is drawn out, then aldosterone is going to increase the osmolarity, where is going to allow for an increase in water retention and allow for increase of water to flow into the cell. So aldosterone is going to be a key hormone that is going to regulate the osmolality of the cell when the concentration of dissolved particles changes its relative concentration because of either reduction in body fluids to sweating or some other process. On slide 54, antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, some of those effects can last for a long time after exercise. And in particular, the sodium retention can also last some time after exercise. And because of that, there could be prolonged effects of hydration levels and osmolarity levels for some time after exercise, which is important because there could be ramifications in terms of hydration levels after exercise. So make sure your athletes continue to hydrate even though they're done with the physical activity. The hypothalamus in the brain is a control center for a very myriad of different functions, including blood pressure, heart rate, vasoconstriction, dilation, and all sorts of different responses in the body. It's also the control center of appetite. There are satiety centers and hunger centers in the ventromedial nucleus and in the lateral hypothalamus, and certain hormones like ghrelin, leptin, and insulin can positively influence or can influence those particular centers in the hypothalamus. The gastrointestinal tract releases hormones that affect the hunger signals when there's a lot of food in the stomach. When the stomach is full, there should be a decrease in appetite and CCK, cholecyclokinin. I'm not exactly sure necessarily. It could be cholecytokinin, CCK, is stimulated. So when the stomach expands and the intestines expand, glucagon-like peptide or GLP. This is not necessarily stuff that I'm going to ask you too much about. All I want you to know is that when you do eat, there are hormones that go to your brain that tell your brain to do something. For the most part, when insulin gets to your brain, it tells your brain, wow, I don't know when we're going to get this sugar again. Maybe we should keep eating. So your body continues to keep eating. When you're done eating, there are also other hormones that tell your body, we don't know when we're going to get this sugar again, so maybe we shouldn't do as much activity. So there's other hormones that get your body to relax when you're eating, after you're done eating, similar to the effect of eating turkey during Thanksgiving. Usually when you're done eating turkey, you want to take a nap. That's because of tryptophan, but it's a very similar kind of situation. Ghrelin is a hormone that's released by your gastrointestinal tract to increase appetite. And then leptin is another hormone that's going to be released to make it so that you don't feel hungry anymore. Well, what happens is sometimes individuals who are obese may have different levels of leptin and ghrelin in their body, and it could be because of these different sensitivities to these hormones that individuals who are obese just have a harder time breaking down and metabolizing different sugars and different fats differently. Maybe they're just more susceptible to the storage of fat, or can't break down sugars more as effectively as others. It could also be used potentially as, and this is the last thing I'll talk about, as an advertising scheme. That's one of the things that high fructose corn syrup in soft drinks does. High fructose corn syrup does not shut off or turn on the leptin response, and it does not shut off the ghrelin response. So if that's the case, you can drink a huge number of calories that are in the form of high fructose corn syrup, and you won't feel that you're hungry. So you can drink 150 calories in a big gulp, but then you can also eat more of their product. One of the things that I suggest to my athletes is to take a look at their sports drinks, and in particular, Powerade has high fructose corn syrup in it, and Gatorade has glucose in it. So I suggest my athletes use glucose products like Gatorade if they're going to, and not something that has a high fructose corn syrup in it. So anyway, I think that'll do it with the chapter. I hope that you guys have a nice day, and I hope I did okay. Take care.